Okay, so thinking on trying to fully pin down the disagreement that I have with what I consider to be the false doctrine or worldview, which is at the core of both Mark and Manuel's uh, outlook, and also whatever project or kinds of projects that. Now, because their projects, I think they do have some practicable, useful scope, but I think that they have to exist within a wider schema, which, in some sense, how they are presenting their project or whatever, I do find it incredibly distasteful. Um, but essentially, what I think their model would be useful, and their types of models and projects is useful, is how you would participate in worldly things. But in some sense, it tries to, in how it draws that arena, because it's missing a kind of fundamental a piece of the puzzle, and in some sense it is running off the assumption that everything is by definition grounded in the participatory realm. And when that is your kind of axiomatic predisposition, if that is your assumption that there is no action, if you propositionally make any internal let's say declaration that action is only ever a reaction to some kind of participatory thing, and then you get into, I mean, you can somehow make that true by just saying, well, you're participating with yourself when you're acting upon your own beliefs, and then those beliefs, you see how they generate propositional statements, and how those propositional statements can sort of circularly reinforce or correspond to perspectival belief structures. So, look, constructively, I guess you could say that you're participating in yourself, or with yourself, or to yourself, or something like that. I think that is slightly awkward, because then you're also saying that sort of that kind of self-participation is contingent on essentially drawing yourself into a hypothetical arena in which there's a multiplicity of yourself, and these things are perhaps constructively fighting it out, and they're participating in some competitive sense or something like that, in terms of mapping how those perspectives and propositions are properly analyzed. So, I mean, now I think that this analysis happens propositionally. So I don't see why you have to go into some kind of participatory metaphor just to suit your definitional axiomatic proclivity. Just to define every action, or everything must be the effect of some kind of participatory session. I mean, I think that is slightly dogmatic, but also not only is it dogmatic, but that leads to very distasteful other things, which I think, in some sense it helps. It could help a true Christian operate in the world of employment, in the world of games, in which that there is no proper grounding of people's understanding. There's only grounding in participatory validation, or where essentially they're confusing a validity test with the actual source of authority itself. So they've got an idolatry of some godly standard, or some fill in for God, which in my view is modeled onto some kind of participatory effigy, or some formula of embodiment, or something like that, which is so everyone must agree on this common yoke of this tether, or something like that. Now, I do think that is actually how the world should roughly be navigated by a Christian when you are dealing, let's say, in purely secular matters. But it allows for no appreciation, but also no proper vindication of the internal understanding and the integrity of an internal locus of control is all sidelined by this, what I consider to be a distasteful dogma that will degrade people also. And I also think that, I mean, I've made this prediction, as it were, that if you do this, what you end up with is the same issue that fascists end up with, is that you end up living in a kind of narrative that you could argue is rich in kind of utilitarian, pro-social, because it's got a validity test sort of built, systematized into its participatory, sort of imprint that people have to sort of conform with as they, I mean, it's interesting because I think that, there's an analogy to be made here that this is similar to the mark of the beast, but that there is no access to the actual thing that is endorsing this thing. It's just taken for granted. There's no actually, there's no agentic buy-in other than, there's also no scope for that particular private sacred secret to be articulated, to be expressed. And so that is perhaps the context and the proper condition that some places in the world have, that, the battlefield, the when you're dealing with some kind of accounting software and you're engaged in some kind of financial transaction on the stock, when you're dealing with sort of blunt systems and statistics, that's that kind of interface. That is how you would have to comport yourself, because you're not dealing in a realm with other agents where agency and free will or anything like that has any kind of there's no nominal reverence or respect for the actual structure that individuals have. It's all conflated into a participatory conscription. And my look, I mean, as I said, like, there are things in the world which you do have to perhaps permit yourself to be conscripted within the context thereof, as long as you don't take that to be the absolute frame or the bedrock or something like that. And this is the confusion which I think is being promulgated by Mark and Manuel, is that their participatory toolkit, in my view, is anathema to the proper understanding of spirit, because it doesn't have this basic category of understanding, and it seeks to displace that basic category with participation. And so there is actually no connection with God. There's only there's no connection in real spiritual devotion or real spiritual integrity is all sidelined and is going to sort of be tended to approximately in the participatory organization. So I think that they have essentially systematized faith into a just kind of into, I mean, I've made specific, I mean, I've decried these things, and I do think that this falls under the heading of, sort of collective, or what do they call it, decentralized collective intelligence. I mean, I've dealt with this topic directly and specifically, and I've spoken about how there is constructively something to something like that, but that it's spiritually poisonous. So, I mean, I have diagnosed this before, and I've talked about this specifically before. And I think that this defect that I've just roughly sketched out, is exactly exhibited by Manuel's, what I consider to be a kind of a deeply ingrained dishonesty, because he can essentially be a troll. Because, as long as he's playing by his participatory rulebook, there's no integrity that has to go both ways. He can just stress test things from his pristine, because he's not the one making truth claims. But, his claims that essentially, while according to his thought experiment, we can assume that I'm true and then proceed from there, and then he's going to show me a technical inconsistency in my worldview, which he doesn't properly understand. And so, he can interrupt me whenever he so wishes to try to preempt and say, well, what you're about to say is something that I don't understand. So, that's why I couldn't let you finish what you were going to say, so that I can essentially say that my framework supersedes your framework and your framework is incoherent. And that is why you just have to relent to my trolling. It's, there's no fundamental integrity there. It's I do think that this does paradoxically relate to issues of narcissism, and I went into that when I was talking about Paul and John Vervaeke, Paul van der Clay and John Vervaeke and Sam, and talking about those issues. I was slightly conflating the issue that I have with Paul with the issue that I have with Mark and Manuel's doctrine, because I do think that they are roughly cohorts in the same kind of ideological circus, if I can put it like that. And it's interesting because I do think that they have tried. And I'm just going to sketch this out, and this is a bit of a repeat to what I've just said before. Is that essentially what they've done is they've homogenized something that should be religion and things that belong to God and the spiritual realm, and they've tried to find a way to homogenize it with the unconscious, the participatory domain, the world, and like, yes, there is this idea that you have to navigate, but there also has to be a kind of a proper priority of certain things. And I think people that have prioritized this kind of trying to make peace with something that cannot be made peace with. You can't make peace with the world. And by trying to create a kind of a Christendom, lowest common denominator, religious ethos that is somehow within the culture and within the kind of the general operating pseudo values, which are incorrectly weighted, or in fact are weighted in a way that I do find distasteful, because they make it, they harden people in this kind of lukewarm homogenization, where essentially they're using the dignity of the collective and the kind to cover over their own spiritual weakness, which they will never be able to diagnose, because essentially anything that relates to the intimate phenomenological, sort of issues of understanding are essentially just gated off by this participatory dogma and reducing everything into participatory representation. This could probably be argued about, on the level of language itself, but fascists make the same kind of, or I've argued with fascists that make this kind of what I think is going on here, which is a similar kind of thing, the same kind of conflation or confusion, that language is itself, because it's fundamentally a mixed thing that is bound up in the participatory realm, that is the source of the thing that generates meaning, or that grounds the meaning, or that anchors it in a way that it can be shared in. And I do think that essentially this overlooks the original condition of the human experience, as it were. You have systematized yourself into this framework and this abstract, we're using language, therefore we have to look at the ideological structure that language is built within, or upon the edifice of, the substrate of the language, and then we can use those to leverage skepticism against our detractors, and we've forged a good excuse as to why everything is fundamentally anchored or grounded in the participatory realm. I do think that essentially Mark is more nuanced, I think, on a lot of these points, and he does almost make concessions, but he doesn't properly perhaps see the weakness of his own position because he lends too much credence, I think, to Manuel. But so he can say, "Oh, okay, I concede that yes, intuition. You can have an intuitive understanding of these things before you have languaged it out." But to language it out, then you are in the realm of participation, and then you are participating with yourself, and then everything is grounded in participation, or we might as well ground everything in participation just as a helpful way, because other people can't intuit things. Other people don't have that faculty. Now, I mean, I concede that point. I think that is the point of what communion actually is, which is grafting that spirit into people via the communion. That is the point. Is the duplication of the spiritual gift within the communion. That comes from what was I was being labeled as, is wanting to brainwash people and treat them with my style of pedagogy, perhaps, and we're getting into trying to be technically tripped up by Manuel's invigilation or inquisition on my on the coherence of my schema. And he wants me to make a claim about where I want to get to, so that he can sort of will say, well, that can only be achieved through some kind of participatory roadmap. Therefore, somehow, because he can describe my project that way, or he wants me to give him that admission that it's a participatory roadmap, so then he can say, well, you see, you're dealing in things that don't have a direct parallel or input to the participant, so I mean, he's just keeps on running on the same assumption that everything must be, that's his axiomatic definition that he proceeds from. And because he won't make that vulnerable in the discussion, then he can continue to lob these dishonest volleys of degradation and trolling, because somehow his schema is perfectly pristine and it cannot be invigilated while he's discussing and testing and stress testing my schema. So it only goes one way, because he can do this, because as long as he gets away with it within the participatory domain, that's dignified enough. As long as the collective can accept that he's acting in integrity, that's good enough, because his integrity is collectivized. It's distributed. And because he has no impetus towards any kind of fundamental integrity or understanding. If he can just get away with it, and that's good enough for him. I mean, this is a juvenile reprobate kind of ideology, and I do think that Mark should see Manuel as an example of his worldview, and I think that should compel some kind of well, at least answer to this challenge. I think that it should caution him to think about, because it is interesting, because I do think that essentially I would even endorse their project as a module for dealing with fundamentally ungodly arenas, or fundamentally ungodly, let's say, games to play. But because it has this fundamental, it's in my view, it has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with how maybe someone who might have religion, a valid religion in my view, would interact with ungodly things. But if that is, sort of it's not basic enough. It's not properly edifying enough. It doesn't have enough categories, and in fact, it actually makes you believe that you can go without a fundamental category, and essentially it does that by, in my view, creating an idolatry, a god of the world. That fundamentally denies, that I mean, I've made this point before, that they clothe this in some kind of Christian apparel, but essentially they have to elevate love your neighbor as you love yourself above God above all. They can only pay lip service to that, which, because everything is grounded in the participatory realm, it just is basically a virtue signal. It's just dogmatic. It doesn't mean anything in terms of the internal schema. It's just irrational. It's like irrational. It's just window dressing. So, love God above all. The first commandment which Jesus gives. The second one is love your neighbor as you love yourself. Is strangely inverted. And then you have all these other cherry-picked things, which, I mean, look, I mean, I can say that they're cherry-picked from my understanding of the doctrine, but I mean, I can understand also that there's a huge tradition of corrupted doctrine that has all of those cherry-picked contortions of my view is that they are contortions of the doctrine. They're all false teaching, essentially. Anyway, okay, so I mean, I think I've generally gone through the whole gambit of this. Oh yeah, so just to finish the point. So I mean, I think that it's interesting because I almost feel that there is a lot of rationalization that they have done, which is actually repurposable, which is very valuable in terms of. And this perhaps, I mean, this occurred to me recently that, because I mean, I was talking about my own psychological modeling and dimensions of psychological reality, that those dimensions can perhaps be understood as describing the arenas of all the viable games that are capable of being played in a way in which you keep, well, in some sense, I mean, the 17-dimensional model itself, it doesn't do this independently, but with the other models of the false ego complex, and understanding, the kinds of pedagogical hiccups that people can be bound in, or the lack of integrity, the lack of understanding and integration between the sides of the mind, that those understanding that holistically gives you essentially a view to use the 17 dimensions as a way of how to engage in viable games that don't essentially reinforce the insanity or the pathological manifestation of developmental self-delusion or self-deception. So I mean, I do relate all of these things to what I generally call self-actualization, or what Mark, as I said, stability is important. But you see, it's interesting because I mean, I think that even shows semantically how he's constantly trying to ground everything into the participatory, and certainly the participatory is an important facet, is something that you have to contend with and grapple with and deal with. And I do think that that is where things in the doctrine of what even Paul would call the upper and the lower register, those things, but have to be sorted out. But if you, I do just think that Mark's whole project has a certain infertility in the in its axiomatic priorities, or in its the values, the hierarchy of its values. There is just an inversion, and that subtle inversion, in my view, it's is interesting because I do find a lot of parallels, but I just think that there's that intrinsic defect ends up making it so poisonous. But and with that they get the world, But in my view, I think they lose God. They end up creating a different kind of God, a participatory God, which that can sound paradoxical from me, because I have said that God can be explained away as a spiritual culture. Anyway, that's going to be slightly disjointed without me repeating all the things that I said but if you just look at these recent recordings, then it's in the first recording. That's an hour and 20 minutes on reply to Sam, John, and Paul, or Sam, Paul, and John, talking about Neoplatonism, because I do in some sense, this issue that I have against Mark and Manuel is the same, not exactly the same, but roughly it falls, in my view, into the same category of issue that I have against Paul, and yeah, which, I mean, it all amounts to take doctrine seriously. To take doctrine seriously, you have to really care about the minutiae of integrity and understanding, which it seems to me everyone is too busy being an energy vampire about some kind of participatory extraction that they can't have the basic impetus to actually take salvation seriously. That it's always either a vicarious redemption, or it's wait until you die and then other things happen. It is always deferring things into, or it's deferring things into a kind of well, I'm just going to help people in general, and then things will work out better, and before actually sorting out these kinds of issues, which in some sense, I mean, I can tell Mark doesn't really care about these complaints that I raise. I'm haranguing him, and he's helping me by helping dissolve the confusion that I have in my mind. It's this, I mean, I'm not going to say that he's in the exchange. I don't think he is that impolite. But I think that is very clearly his. I mean, look, and I mean, you could say I have the same. I have at least a similar disposition, in terms of the belief of my coherence as being superior. Although it is slightly different, because I actually am making the claim forthrightly, and he is making a kind of excuse claim. Well, what he's doing is good enough. And it's sort of it's based on an excuse, and it's sort of, and he doesn't really have to talk about doctrine seriously, and he doesn't really take doctrine seriously, but he's trying to synthesize some kind of generally positive stepping stone that comports with his worldview, but he's not maybe going to make that vulnerable to being part of the exchange, because the worldview and the schema that they have, essentially, because it can ground everything in the participatory. It's interesting because Mark also has this bit of philosophy where he talks about middle out thinking, where I think that he's operating in a middle out narrative. I mean, his whole how he sets up his worldview and then proceeds from it. I mean, he said, "Well, I proceed after creation." So essentially, he can't know God because we can only know God by our participation in creation. Now, that is true if you think that you have to run on ontology. I don't think you have to run on ontology. I think you have to run on epistemology, which is why the propositional, you have to get it right. You actually have to care about getting it right. Otherwise, you can't actually be coherent and self-consistent and get your communication in order, because that has to come in order from the ego, from the propositional side of things. So you do need to have a redeemed ego. You need to have a crucifying, blameless ego. The ego has to be capable of humility and capable of getting its hands dirty and doing the technology of the crucifixion. I mean, anyway, this is getting... But it's complicated. It's complicated. But we can't get to these complications because I'm dealing with conceited people, essentially. And then they have a rubric that works. It doesn't work exactly, in my view. It doesn't work good, but in their view it works well enough, because they can ground, it's a circular thing, because they ground everything in participation. So if it's good enough in participation, then they can judge themselves based on the ostensible fruits of their own labor. Never mind, if the fruits of their labor in 500 years is essentially a kind of a new kind of nonsense ideology in which people have even forgotten, the words of introspection, because everything has been displaced by the metaphor of participation, and there's no actual phenomenological recourse. which they believe can't be expressed in language anyway. And I mean, technically that's true. You can't express it in language. That's why all the scripture is filled essentially with a essentially the spiritual language. It's metaphorical in some sense, um, or it's metaphorical, or it's, you know, Jordan Peterson, I guess, used the phrase, it's truer than true. Um, and it's truer than true because you freely choose to value it as such and you endorse it as such, and at the same time you can see other people's values and what they endorse and how they are infusing their epistemic agency into underwriting their epistemic responsibilism, and then they are treating people on that view, as it were, with that spiritual discerning. And it's not, oh, does it look beautiful or not? According to what standard? According to that standard. That is the standard maker. The discerning spirit. Okay, and yeah, so ontologically, how do you ground the discerning spirit? Yes, that is a bit of a post hoc thing that comes afterwards. And if you want to try to ground it in a haphazard way like Mark and Manuel have, then they'll try to do some trickery around participation, because that's the only vector that it's going to come to you anyway. So let's just kind of conflate it into the participatory domain fundamentally. That's an assumption. And it's fundamentally, it's a blind faith assumption as well, but it also, in my view, you know, placing God in the unconscious in that way. In some sense, that's the function of the Holy Ghost. But I mean, these people, I don't think that they take the Trinity seriously, or if they do, they've got crazy, stupid doctrinal nonsense about it. Or in my view, I mean, look, there's a lot of nonsense about the Trinity all over the place because there's a giant tradition of false teaching and false doctrine. So you know, they can cite a lot of historical resonance, I'm sure, but. Anyway, so I mean, look, we do just have fundamentally different doctrines and worldviews, but I do think that it's interesting that I do think that how they comport the actual discourse about this is fundamentally dishonest, and I think that that is a symptom of their toxic worldview. And okay, let me stop repeating myself. There concludes my complaint. I should quickly qualify one of the last points that I made there by adding this extra explanation. So another one of the problems of having this participatory culture where, you know, the spiritual world is completely grounded in these participatory metaphors is that you end up with the same problem in India. Essentially, I mean, you end up with the polytheistic, atomized disconnection from God. That you can access God as an atom through the participatory domain only by being a cog in some participatory mechanism, or you can be surrounded by this spiritual menagerie that is constructed from what I would think to be polytheistic elements, because you're not addressing God in an original understanding. You I mean, okay, this is slightly parallel to the issue that I think Mark inherits by proceeding from, you know, after creation. So he proceeds from supposedly assuming that God gives us creation and then we participate in creation. But because he won't intellectually, propositionally interrogate this, he will only proceed after that. I do think that he constructively disposes of the access that you have to understanding God. And because he doesn't take that issue seriously, because, you know, anything that is worth understanding about God, you have to sort of contextualize within the you know, because of this table thumping about the importance of the participatory realm. It overlooks God fundamentally as a serious issue that you have to carefully grapple with, and that you have to ground within yourself and root within yourself in your connection to it, because that is all done from Mark in terms of the participatory realm, or the somehow it's within the creation itself. And that, I mean, there are lots of very sophisticated, nuanced little issues with that end up polluting, I think, his general lack of doctrine, or anyway, yeah. Yes, I mean, it's too much for me to go and to diagnose all of this. But this is why when I talk to Mark and Manuel, all I get is this kind of barrage of complaints that come from the assumption that they've got a coherent worldview and that I don't. Is because they're proceeding from a blind faith, essentially. And although that blind faith has some weird kind of approximations in it that are fundamentally grounded in the participatory realm, I mean, in my view, it's fundamentally ungodly. But it does a good job at pretending, or being able to simulate a pretense that supposedly, is something that God would smile upon. That's what they sort of are left with. And then they can only know that through the participatory embrace, or the participatory feedback. So, you end up living in a kind of... I do think that there are problems here, because I do think that this, maybe it's slightly unfair to characterize it this way, but I think this, like all external locuses of control, you end up with a kind of solipsism, or some kind of morality is fundamentally ungrounded in integrity, or there's a fundamental disregard for character, or the character of an understanding. It's all just, again, I mean, it's to confuse the, because you can say, well, the participatory realm, we do have to learn how to discern this in order to validate other people's claims or whatever, and it's using the validity test to displace the source of authority, or the source of truth itself. So, it's sort of creating an idolatry out of a validity test. I mean, and in some sense, in some context, it is a viable strategy, if I can put it like that, when you're dealing in things that are fundamentally ungodly, but not when you're dealing with other agents. There's a fundamental missing category there. Anyway, I'm not going to repeat myself further. That has to do with the value priorities and things like that. I think I might have come up with a better reduction of this whole issue, whereas, and I'm sure semantically I'll be argued with in making this claim, but I would say de facto Mark's worldview is instrumentalizing God, although in some sense he could argue that perhaps he can modify that claim that I just made into saying that he's only instrumentalizing the category of God. I think de facto it amounts to the same thing, but this is the result of essentially making God a purveyor of instrumentality, and the only source of which, or our only connection thereto, is through the participatory realm. And therefore you are grounding anything and everything to do with God in the metaphor of participation, or something like that. Or you can only use elements of participation as metaphors to measure up against other elements of participation, so that you are just trying to conciliate patterns of symbols and other such things. And that is how you are groping towards the approximation, or something like that, via the collective project that religion therefore amounts to. That you are participating in your religion, you don't have an understanding of it, and in some sense that is just kind of atomized, or is cordoned off as a kind of as a weird solipsistic project, and if people are doing that, then we can just troll them until we get them out of it. Or, it's open season for those types of people that think that there's anything like individual integrity, that actually want to make that part of the culture, as it were, or at least the actual engagement from the individual side in the negotiation or exchange, And yes, there's a problem of translation here, but the idea that you can say that, well, the issues in translation therefore mean that we have to find an ulterior source of authority that is externally located, an external locus of control, which is their test or their validation, which is, the participatory realm. They then substitute the real McCoy for a virtue test or a purity test, and therefore everyone can just get by the virtue signal. And this isn't, look, I mean, I'm stating their case a bit too strongly, because it's not as if that this can't be jested at. This can be pointed to. I mean, I am pointing to it, that they do have the wrong priority in their values, because they can't claim to love God above all and then love their neighbor as they love their self. They have to invert that. They have to turn it upside down. They have to do it backwards. They have to first have a definition of success, which they ground externally to their own understanding, because their own understanding is, according to this definitional axiomatic worldview, can only ever be sort of residue that collects, or sort of that somehow is tending toward. I mean, in my view, it's a kind of Darwinist. It's a kind of sort of subtle Darwinism that is disguising itself slightly in some Christian window dressing, but it's heavily contorted in order to provide for this latitude of essentially using a blind faith, and seemingly getting away with it because of all the nice things that it can ostensibly provide people in their participatory that they're going to be usefully imprinted on, and they're going to sort of be sort of implicitly seduced and inculcated into, being conscripted into this higher functioning model, which will give them a greater sensitivity to these things, or because in some sense the modeling that macrocosmic participatory realm is what they think understanding is essentially conformity to the right theocratic narrative. Essentially, there is no personal religion, essentially, or if there is one, it only matters in so much as that it can lead to a kind of implicit conscription, and so I do think that they are nebulous on grounding basic semantics. So you end up having to make a mockery of what the definition of the Spirit is, or what the definition of God is. It always is this kind of very nebulous thing, and essentially it becomes the worldly fruit is conflated with it, and these things become homogenized and indistinguishable, and there's no discerning between the two, except by some lowest common denominator consensus of that there is a. It's almost like, I mean, I think it's similar to the fascistic totalitarian kind of worldview, that there is this kind of destiny in your blood kind of thing, that the narrative of the world can only tend towards one ultimate homogenized, settled, and in some sense it does this because essentially it doesn't care enough to get into the minutiae, to get into the details. It's just it's a waste of time, because we can get people into the right program, or following our program of conscription, which we have already determined is good enough, but we won't defend it in the abstract. We'll defend it with hard skepticism against anybody else who tries to model any kind of ulterior system, and we'll do that by trolling them, essentially. and which is the same way that, I mean, I think that this is the same strategy that is used by, I mean, you could see this in, you know, how new atheists would play this. I mean, for me, it's just, it's the immaturity of, I mean, I link it slightly to, look, this is a complicated thing to talk about the cerebral histrionic, and how it sort of, it could be described as narcissistic, or it could be described, yeah, the cerebral histrionic and narcissism are almost two sides of the same coin. They do manifest differently because I think the narcissist essentially just fudges the participatory realm. And there is a bit of fudging also with the cerebral histrionic, but that sort of becomes a forced error that they can compel because to conform with the rightness of their belief structures, which they say are not rightness about their belief structures, they're rightness about the participatory arena itself. It's metaphysically innate in the participatory arena. So they say, no, our locus of control is external, and our beliefs are grounded in them. But you know that's, you know, so it's basically saying I'm outside my own mind. I don't have my own beliefs. My beliefs are modeled to me by the participatory truth, and therefore you can't argue with me. Arguing with me is like arguing with the absolute truth. While they say that nobody else can actually contain the truth. So it's a self-denigrating then projection of that self-denigration, that they don't have the same excuse-making capacity that the cerebral histrionic has. And it is true that to actually have a stable ontology, it will always be a kind of post hoc rationalization in terms of propositionally, but there's but there's something before arriving at the ontology. There is the actually having to pay for your own epistemology yourself, which is, I'm not going to get into replicating all of this, but this is essentially what the crucifixion is that you are paying for playing the game of the identity, and you are being accountable for that engagement in the ungodly, confused, you know, you're allowing yourself to be crucified by the worldly argument, and you are owning your participation in that, let's say, provocation. And I was trying to get into this. It is very complicated, like, because, you know, that Jesus was silent before his accusers, and you see, this is the thing, that the understanding is still blameless, but the identity is not actually completely blameless, because silence is dishonorable. So in some sense, Jesus is being complicit in his own crucifixion. And then he's asking, Father, why have you forsaken me? Because he's not asking that question on his own behalf of his own understanding. He's asking it on behalf of the identity that he has mixed up. He's mixed up the role that he's playing. He's mixed up his ego, his propositional commitment to play this role in this game, essentially. But he's paid for the game, so it's covered by his understanding. So there is resurrection, essentially, that his integrity escapes the dishonor, as it were, and it is vindicated as blameless and righteous. So, you know, because essentially, you know, you involve yourself in stupid games and you win stupid prizes, and that's basically what the crucifixion is. But essentially, that's the you can call it sort of being a spiritual creditor, and giving other people a share in your own self-made value, being the creditor that provides the value to the purpose economy, which has now got real value running through it, rather than essentially everyone trying to leverage excuses and external locuses of control and idolatries. You've actually saddled them now with some real value, which you've donated to them by allowing them to crucifix you, to crucify you, but they are cursed with the Holy Ghost, which is what the Holy Spirit is. And that is basically because they languish in the question which was not even asked by them, but ends up being asked on behalf of them, which is, Father, why have you forsaken me? That is the curse of the Holy Spirit. Or that is the curse that the Holy Spirit is, because it testifies to the Spirit of man to precipitate the Son of Man. So then these people can ask, oh, well, we accused this person, but we didn't ask. We made accusations. We didn't ask questions. We made accusations. We weren't in a meta-negotiation. We weren't being in an honest investigation about the matter, wanting to know the truth of the matter and wanting to see what integrity really looks like, because we didn't even have integrity. So now we've kind of we've had our destiny and our fate woven into this man's crucifixion, and we sit inheriting his question, Father, why have you forsaken me? So that is the question that curses these people, that curses the world, that leads captivity captive, that leaves the spirit of man captive. Is that, and that is the question. When you properly resolve the answer to that question, then that is the gift of prophecy. Is why? Why was Jesus forsaken? You know, because he wasn't, essentially, but it's a paradox. It's a paradox that belongs to a kind of dead player identity until you become an active conscious player that's capable of making the same, at least the same allegorical procedure of being a mind that is dying daily and crucifying itself, to be a crucifying mind, an ego that is capable of that. You could call it a faux, it's not exactly a faux death, because you are actually infusing the, I mean, if a replay-by-play of the crucifixion is in 1 John chapter 5, when it talks about when you see someone who sins a sin not unto death. And, you know, and maybe it'll be prayed for in the name of the Son of God. And maybe, okay, because I mean, there are, let's say, there are gradations of crucifixion, as it were, because this is something that is a continual process. It's not it doesn't stop happening, as it were. But there is also a lot of integration within one's own ego and the super-ego, because essentially there are participatory themes and narratives and intrigues and curiosities and mysteries which do have to be worked out, because otherwise, I mean, this cerebral histrionic sort of thing is one of them. Because you do essentially have to stop being dependent on the participatory arena. You have to have this internal locus of control and this internal source of integrity, where you can say my mind is the only begotten Son, and that it can actually burden the sins of the world. That doesn't mean that the world will receive the truth. No, it doesn't. In fact, it literally means the opposite of that. It's not necessary. In fact, the world will never receive the truth, but that there might be a precipitation of another Son of Man, essentially. But it's the same Son of Man, it's the same spirit, it's the same style, it's the same quality of the mind, it's the same condition of the understanding. And, you know, that brokering that is literally what the gift of the deacon is. That is what the deacon does, is the deacon rescues the soul from the world, as it were, because it sees that there's a chink in the window. They see that there's an entry point, there's a ray of light that might be able to make a connection. But this is, I mean, you know, there are things about beauty here which are problematic, because you know, there's the unconscious participatory realm will have, you know, people are slaves to the world. They are And you can get into a position where you have enough doctrine that you can sort of have enough armor to this to be aware of your own corruption or something like that. But there's going to be an allergy that usually has to do with essentially some kind of fetish or cult about some standard of beauty or something like that. That you haven't met the formulaic recipe that particularly tends to a particular, I'm going to have to use a vague word, but essentially that there's a particular entanglement within the soul knot of the particular false ego complex, of the particular self-deception and self-delusion. And so, but the idea is essentially that, you can't actually educate people out of this, but you can pedagogically assist the people that want to be assisted. You can help people help themselves, essentially, but I mean, it's not a necessity. I mean, it's a good hope, and it's a good faith to work towards such things. If you can see, if you have the gift of the deacon, and you can see a particular hope of fruition of reaping a soul from the world, but I mean, the possibility for people to do this, I mean, is really described in the scriptures very clearly. The meek will inherit. Those who are willing to lose their lives will save it, and the inverse for those who don't. But essentially, there has to be some kind of value for some kind of proper, justified understanding. I mean, if you are willing to settle for less than a justified understanding, quite frankly, you're dabbling. You're looking for a purveyor. You are, and you're not willing to pay the price of the participant, the actual because I mean, you can contextualize anyone as a purveyor, I guess, but when you actually come across the purveyor, the price is too steep. There isn't enough reciprocation in terms of what I would argue is essentially a kind of metaphysical vanity. I mean, if you have the truth, and defend it, but if you have a kind of half-broken, collectivized, outsourced, what do they call it, decentralized intelligence, well, then you can actually, in some way, I think that you could almost stably self-deceive yourself. You could create a kind of polytheistic corruption which can never sort of unfuck itself, essentially. And yeah, I mean, that's essentially what I see as the problem with Mark and Manuel's project. I think that is its fundamental impetus, and I mean, I do think that Paul is a little bit a part of this, Paul van der Klee, because I do think that this might be a slight outgrowth of. There's something about that homogenized so-called Christian doctrine that precipitates this kind of salvation for the city, salvation for the sociological structure. Some kind of half-baked, homogenized solution, which is more about sort of safeguarding its own sanctimonious claim to fame, but at the cost of essentially the individual connection to proper integrity and understanding and connection with God. So yeah. and I was slightly disturbed. I mean, maybe I didn't follow what Mark was saying, but he was talking about BLM solving other people's other problems that are problematic in the system. And I mean, I wonder, I mean, if he's endorsing some version of identity politics, or that there is some aspect to that participatory problem that needs to be solved, by curbing or by conditioning people into something which is fundamentally not grounded within their own ethics and integrity, but is just kind of policed by some kind of virtue marker, or I mean, anyway, I mean, I'm conflating. I have conflated Mark with his worldview and his project with something like a kind of totalitarian schema. So I mean, I do see why Babsy would comport himself and with saying that there are. I mean, I don't know if he said that in a slightly sarcastic way, or if he was just making a kind of technical point in which that was a kind of. But I mean, again, either way, I think that is. In either case, if he was endorsing it or if he was just using it as just a technical point that makes his point, I think that he should be more careful to realize that, although if that's a slightly sarcastic point, why is it that he can issue such technical statements that essentially endorse things like identity politics, which are fundamentally ungrounded and untethered to proper ethics or morality? But I mean, my answer to this is that because he doesn't properly ground ethics or morality himself, Mark grounds it in the participatory realm. And so because if everything is reducible to that, then you can use ulterior methodology to locate things. You can use ungodly tools to signify to you that there is some moral problem. And I don't want to discount that might not be a speculative thought experiment that you could run in order to try, but you would still have to independently rework that. If you want to look for statistical outliers and you want to look for, let's say, disruption in patterns, you still have to understand the disruption of the pattern independently of if you've found it through some kind of technical analysis. But I think that sensitivity is essentially is missing in the whole worldview there, because the only thing that they have is the participatory realm. So they end up being, in my view, exactly like scientists or the scientism, or it's functionally indistinguishable. I don't see how their program of worldview is any different, except that it's got some supposed religious terms sprinkled onto it, and some window dressing from Christianity sort of crowded into it. But in my view, it's closer to a kind of polytheism than anything else. And I think even how, I mean, if I don't like making these kinds of remarks, but if you but you can see that there is, if you've ever debated people in very intellectual Hindus and getting into spiritual philosophy, there is the same kind of this is an ad hominem claim. There is the same, I would just call it cerebral histrionic atomization, where essentially, it's weird. They're saying, you can't represent truth or the spirit of truth or God or something, or an understanding of God, because my understanding of God is external to me and that's where it must stay. It's like, what are you cutting back at me with? Just essentially being bogged down by being trolled with table thumping, with people just saying, no, but our axioms are arranged with this priority, and so we've got different axioms, we've got a different worldview, but your worldview you don't make susceptible to being critiqued, or it just goes over your head, or it can't be followed. And I do think that this is essentially a kind of a psychological juvenile. I mean, I would call this kind of, I mean, to use Keegan stages as a metaphor, essentially, it's an exact half breed between what I would call Keegan stage 2.5 and Keegan stage 3.5, that is playing a reflection game, a parallel game with each other. That's sort of what cerebral histrionic is. Whereas a full-blown narcissist is just kind of in Keegan stage 2.5, but has got a kind of a strange connection to their ego, which is also then creating a triangulation against their own unconscious side of the mind, which they are, in some sense, grounding within their perspectival subconscious belief structure. So they've got these very strange beliefs, which I've described that in earlier recordings. I'm not going to repeat all of it. Anyway, I'm going on, and this is getting very rambly. But anyway. And I do think that this is dangerous. I mean, this is a kind of, structurally, I mean, I have the same fear and the same argument against what I call proto-fascism, which is sort of what Hitler would have called useful idiots, because they have the same fascistic worldview, but it's much more intellectually pristine and intellectually balanced within its own construction. And it really, I think, what ends up sort of becoming its god is this kind of, and I know that this is paradoxical, and people, and on the other side, I can be accused of what I'm about, of the same complaint that I'm about to make, is that, it essentially, it ends up being atomized on the level of authority or grounding, and therefore it's fundamentally sort of on an epistemological level, it's solipsistic. And it just has a completely different description of this, which is essentially a dogma about the participatory arena, about what the participatory arena contains or entails. And so, I mean, in some sense you could say, well, these people, they've been trapped in a room. They haven't experienced that there are other things outside that room. They've been trapped in this, that they haven't come across people that have challenged their presuppositions or their values and the priority structure of those values, and they are stuck in a recurring loop. And I do think that essentially and I mean, this is not how I think Mark would describe it at all, and perhaps he would think that this sounds weird, but I think that these are people, because they wanted to proceed from a correct ontology, so they constructed a blind faith around to grant themselves an ontology to begin with, because they didn't want to proceed without it. And so they've got essentially a half-baked rationalization that is associated with all these other models, and half-baked rationalization, because it all inherits that core lack of fidelity or lack of proper anchorage. And so, it just always leverages that chip on its shoulder as its protective armor against anybody else who has any kind of ulterior schema or worldview. Then the chip on the shoulder gets activated, and you get this juvenile trolling. And I mean, I do think that it is essentially this connection between, it is a confusion within the identity complex. And I mean, I think in going through this has been helpful, because I think now I've perhaps got a better understanding myself of a model of cerebral histrionic, because I've got hours and hours and hours of describing these different, sort of developmental obstacles and sort of psychopathologies, and I think that this I think this has helped me to pin it down more. But yeah, I mean, I'll have to make a purely psychological recording where I try to distinguish between all the particular differences between narcissism and cerebral histrionic, and also retouch on the problem in that everything can also be described as some form of anything can be accused as being kind of cerebral histrionic, because if anything purports to be self-consistent, it's going to have some kind of parallel reference. Actually, no, I think what I just said is incorrect, because the parallel reference should be between the propositional and the perspectival, between the subconscious and the ego, whereas I was just saying that the problem with cerebral histrionics is between the perspectival and the participatory. I guess maybe that is what the confusion is that they are displacing, they are in some ways, they are conflating the participatory and the propositional. And they think that they are just leaving the propositional aside. They're just jettisoning it and they're dispensing with it. Therefore, they can de facto have this kind of implicit, almost narcissistic behavior because they aren't representing propositional claims. They are only representing the truth of the environmental plane itself. You know, that they are camouflaged with their environment. They are the snake slithering, completely immersed, and they say, no, it's not me, it's the environment, watch where you step. You know, that's their whole intellectual disposition. I think that is essentially the disposition of the cerebral histrionic. But I mean, they very clearly they do make propositional claims as they do this. And they're even self-aware of doing this. So I do think that there is a lot of bad faith. That it's not just blind faith. At some point, it's obvious that there's also bad faith operating here. And that, let's say, that incredulity to being self-aware of that, I think, makes them particularly reprehensible and dishonest, essentially, but also why they stick together like bandits and they reinforce each other in terms of covering each other's chip on the shoulder and creating this kind of dog-piling intellectual furor. And I mean, I wonder how much, that the problem here, and I'm sorry that I'm making all these really horrible parallels between fascism, but I do, sadly, I do think that it is appropriate, but I'm just trying to make this for the purpose of clarity, is that then what you get is you get grand dragon wizards like Paul van der Clay, who sees this and he says, oh, you see, this is why we must have, that you have these different types of immaturity that get into this kind of sociological complex where they reinforce each other, where they reinforce each other's juvenile, developmental, and because they can all give sympathy to one another and tend to one another. And so then Paul van der Clay, is sort of, I mean, I don't want to be too nasty in this kind of parallel, but essentially Paul van der Clay is sort of, in my view, stands at a slight distance from this because, and he just kind of holds the icon of the elements and the tenets that will lead towards some kind of sociological grand resolution to these kinds of problems, because essentially he doesn't get into the fray of actually trying to construct it, because if he tried to construct it himself, he would be getting his hands dirty with the bad faith a bit too directly. But if other people sort of manifest it and he sort of encourages or inspires them to make it happen, and because they actually engineer it for him, he'll be grateful for them if they do so. So he's just a kind of, he's almost like a catalytic, symbolic figurehead, of this kind of majesty in this model of what I can only describe as a kind of dominion. But I mean, so I don't wish to look. I must sound like I'm being very pejorative, and I don't mean this in a. I mean this in a spiritual sense. I don't mean this. The Antichrist is something. Is not. I mean, like, technically, everyone is an Antichrist if they don't do the full work of salvation. Like, technically not exactly. I mean, if you understand enough doctrine and you haven't fully gone through the process of salvation, then you're not an Antichrist. But there's no special status attached to being an Antichrist. It's a spiritual condition that most people are in. Okay, it's not that important. The more important thing is the false prophet, and how far are you in placing the false prophet in the lake of fire? And that is the actual thing. That's the race that needs to be run, as it were. And tending to that task, which is something that many people are just seemingly not interested in whatsoever. They are doing something else. They are running. The kingdom of God comes not with observation. They're running that backwards. They are looking for the inverse of that very clearly. And these are just sort of multiple manifestations of that. Okay, so I mean, I didn't indict Paul too badly there, I think, but I'm still displeased with all of this doctrinal stuff, which I think should be sorted out doctrinally. But anyway, I mean, there's only so much someone can do bashing one's head against a brick wall of people who, in my view, clearly love the darkness.